Tras romper relaciones diplomáticas con Taiwán, el gobierno de Daniel Ortega
Beijing at its eyes fixed on commercial opportunities in South America.
中国不断提升与拉丁美洲国家的合作关系。
En su gira por Latinoamérica, el presidente Xi Jinping
我们只有勇于自我革命，才能赢得历史主动。
Hello from Barcelona. My name is Monika Prusinowska, and I'm delighted to be your host for today's episode. Thank you, Parsifal, for your kind invitation. As a word of self-introduction, I'm currently a Ramon y Cajal Fellow at the University of Barcelona, Law Faculty, Public International Law Department. My work perspective has been shaped by nearly a decade of experience in China, where I studied, researched, and practiced Chinese law and its interaction with other legal systems. I dedicate my work to fostering more informed dialogue with China for both academia and practitioners, focusing on the issues of legal engagement. As part of my current research agenda, I look at the legal issues surrounding the presence of Chinese investors in Latin America. Today, we have a great pleasure to have with us Marco Germanò. Marco is a doctoral researcher at the University of Toronto, Faculty of Law, a research associate at the China Law and Development Project at the University of Oxford, which is where we met, and a research assistant at Guarani Global Law and Tech at New York University. Marco has held academic and professional positions at Peking University as a Yenqing Scholar, the United Nations, the International Law Commission, the National Autonomous University of Mexico, and the Institute for Applied Economic Research in Brazil, and this is only among other institutions that he served. In his current work, drawing on a comparative experience, Marco examines how governance mechanisms function under asymmetrical, transnational conditions. Marco, welcome. It is a real pleasure to have you here.
Hi, Monica. It's actually my pleasure. Thank you very much for having me. Excited to be here with you today. Looking forward to this discussion.
Perfect. To start, Marco, could you please tell us a bit about your professional journey and especially what drew you to focus on China?
Absolutely. So I'm from Brazil, from the south of Brazil, the city called Porto Alegre. And about 5-6 years ago, I began to become interested in the phenomena of China, right? I'd say the journey towards China was both a structural driver and also an individual one. A structural one because, as you know, China has become a very important topic in Latin America in recent years. So we start hearing more about it in the news. We hear more about Chinese investments, trade with China around our countries. And there is this growing interest to what does that mean? Coming from a law school, coming from a legal field, there is this interest to understand as well what are the legal aspects of this growing engagement between our countries and also increasingly our populations, a lot of people-to-people exchanges. And I think that's also what we're going to discuss in terms of exchanges between lawyers. From my own perspective, there was also an individual drive in the sense that there was an opportunity to start studying this, to start doing research about China back in my hometown. That led me to another project, which led me to another one, finally to the project at Oxford, where we met. And finally I decided that this was something that was becoming more relevant to my own work, and did apply and went to China to study there, to live there for a year at the Yenqing Academy in Beijing. So this has pretty much been a little bit of my journey towards China. I think I have been lucky in some way because, and this is something that I can add in terms of this comparative experience, what we find, what is challenging, especially coming from countries such as Brazil or other countries in the global south, it is, even if you're interested in a topic, if you want to do some research about that, it's often very challenging. You don't find enough opportunities. You don't find funding, which is quite different from schools and institutions, especially in the United States or in Europe, or you have more institutional support. That's not the case in Brazil. So always trying to be able to do some interesting research, or that is also a very financial institutional challenge. So yeah, so far I can say I have been lucky to have been meeting people and trying to do some work.
Marco, thank you for this introduction. I can tell you that we share the concerns in Europe that oftentimes things are more difficult than, for instance, in US in terms of approaching China and related research. But that, to me, means that this is exactly where we need to push for more of local expertise, right?
Absolutely, yeah, absolutely.
So, Marco, if I could just follow up on your experience as a Yanqing scholar, that was at Peking University, one of the top universities in China. Could you tell us a little bit about it? What kind of scholars are you? What were you focusing on? And what's the meaning of that for your work?
Absolutely. Yeah. So for those that might not know, the Yanqing School is a program that was developed by Peking University in some ways similar to other programs that you can find around the world to try to attract people to your country to be able to study, learn more about a place from within, right? And it is also a point of international exchange to other countries. A little bit of how you have Chevening in the UK, you have Erasmus in Europe, right? These are programs that provide the international exchange and also a top tier education to interested students. So that was a program that was developed in 2015 or 16, if I'm not mistaken. Since then, it has been attracting about 100, 120 students from around the world. And there you have different focus areas from archaeology, history to more law and economics. I did the law track, law and society, which is a very interesting program because they try to give you an introduction to Chinese law, which is still something that we don't find as usual. We don't find usually in curriculums around the world, right? Chinese law is not an accessible topic in universities around the world. So they do try to give you that introduction, but they do so as well, trying to inform you about what is the social context of the Chinese legal system, which is somewhat different from what we find in our countries, the Anglo-American tradition. Even though perhaps increasingly the legal forms are more similar, right? We see some type of harmonization between China and the world, which was important for its for its participation in the global stage of economic exchange. Is still the mindset of the legal system in China is informed by other ideas, right? Confucius or the millennial, the thousands of years of tradition in China. So I focus on that, and in my work was there that I started focusing more on this idea of what it meant in terms of people-to-people exchanges in the legal field. And I focus especially on lawyers and law firms and try to understand what are the exchanges that were happening in that arena.
Perfect. Thank you. And I could not agree more with you in the sense that if one wants to understand the Chinese legal system, in order to be able to interact with that, you do really need to understand the society. And I remember when I fresh arrived to Beijing and my first course at Tsinghua University was Chinese law and society. And I felt in a way offended that I'm already a master in law. Let's move to serious stuff. And only later I realized that the society part and all of the Chinese characteristics surrounded the Chinese legal systems is the clue and necessary element to understand what happens in the legal world there.
Totally, yeah.
So,
And especially
Mark,
if I can just jump in, I think in that sense that the Chinese culture is really rich, in providing this so many how could I define it? But there are so many elements that contribute to the structure of the society that you won't find in legal texts, that you need to understand how the society moves. That happens in other countries as well. It's not something specific particular to China, but I think to understand what's going on in China, it's important to have this dimension of the social, of the culture, of the, what's beyond the legal text.
Perfect. Perfect. So this is our first common recommendation, to study Chinese law in a more holistic way, associated with the elements of society, economy, etc., etc. So, Marco, perhaps with that, we can move to your very interesting and relevant topic that you addressed during the conference in Barcelona earlier this year. We were focusing in general on the legal issues related to Chinese investment in Latin America, and you specifically presented on the topic of the role of law firms and lawyers in facilitating cross-border deals. You obviously focus on the Chinese investment, taking two specific jurisdictions as case studies. These were Brazil and Mexico. Generally, we know that lawyers are agents that play an important role in governing any economic activity. They provide legal services to guide legal investors through regulatory and legal frameworks, which obviously becomes very relevant, especially if you're a foreign investor in a foreign legal system. This is to enable the investment in the first place. Later, lawyers help with a whole number of issues ranging from compliance to dispute resolution, and that's why this topic is very important. Could you therefore tell us a little bit more about this research in the context of Brazil and Mexico? What do you research? How do you research? And why do you research?
Absolutely. I think you gave a great intro, Monica, there, because as the topic of lawyers has become, it's not new. I think the second part of the 20th century, it became clear that lawyers had this important role in the cross-border capital flows, especially those, I think, especially those from the Anglo-American tradition, that became is important in supporting the capital flows that were happening from the US, from Europe. They gave this support that you mentioned. They also legitimize these deals, right? They provide legitimate.
Marco, here I would have a question to help our audience. What does it mean, this Anglo-American lawyers and law firms? For not all of our audience is well versed in law, so I'm sure it would be helpful to understand who these players are.
Sure, yes. So, with in the 20th century, just to provide a little bit of context, right? In 20th century, with this financial globalization, where we have capital flows flowing out from big sectors such as the US, such as big countries in Europe, UK, Germany, and these companies try to produce in other countries to sell their goods. They need to establish operations there. This capitals flow with the need of legal knowledge, right? You need to understand what's happening in other countries to be able to establish your operations, as well as to create points of exchange, where you can do a deal with someone from other country, right? You're a company in the US, you want to deal with someone in Mexico, you need to understand what are the local legal forms, and also try to establish points of contact that make you to talk the same language, same legal language between two different jurisdictions. Throughout the 20th century, especially in the second half of it, what we saw is that lawyers and law firms from the United States and also from the United Kingdom, they provided this global support for these companies. One reason for that is naturally, those are some of the biggest countries that were exporting these capital flows. So they were the countries, the law firms that were interested in providing this support. Another reason is that while doing so, they were able to influence what were the global standards for doing cooperation and business among countries, right? A classic example that we talk about in the literature is that you have the model of arbitration to solve disputes. Arbitration was not always the go-to method of resolving disputes in commercial and economic matters. But then in the last decades, that become the model, that become the blueprint to business around the world. And that was very much influenced by the United States. We have also the practice, you can think about offshore channels for investment. So you use a different jurisdiction, a third jurisdiction that has less taxes to invest in another country. That was not always what happened, and that became the practice, very much influenced by these law firms that became key players in doing business abroad. So when we talk about what these lawyers do, I think it's important to pinpoint that we are talking about a very specific model of lawyering that is very much influenced by Anglo-American and also European, but I would say especially Anglo-American lawyers, because they were the ones that kick-started that process and established more or less the standards that would influence other jurisdictions, right? So that I lost a little bit of myself, Monica, but we were in the and the usual examples that we cite are fresh. I would say is the white shoes law firms that you have in New York. Those are the biggest law firms in terms of revenue and also in terms of lawyers. I wouldn't be focusing on names, but you probably can find those in a quick Google search, as well as you have the ones in London. I'm missing the name right now, but I'm sorry, Monica. So, and basically, these are the biggest law firms in terms of revenue and also in terms of number of lawyers. In the United States, they're usually known as the white shoes, the magic circle, as well as in UK. So those are the Anglo-American law firms that we refer to. Now, connecting this to the Brazilian-Mexico case, it's interesting because these firms are the ones that usually supported also the Chinese companies investing in Brazil and Mexico. And why that happened, right? These firms have been operating the country and facilitating international investment for decades. So they had the know-how to how to engage in these countries, right? They also possess this global legal form. So Chinese companies doing business in Brazil and Mexico, when they started doing so, they did it by the blueprints that were available. They used these legal forms, and I think an interesting parenthesis here is that when I say legal forms, I'm making reference to this understanding that is by Matthew Urey from the University of Oxford and also Cida Liu from the University of Toronto, that they talk about legal forms not only as, let's say, very strictly legalistic terms, but also thinking about the cultural institutional practices that surround and support this more legal aspects of a trade deal, right?
And Marco, just to confirm, this kind of big Anglo-American law firms, I understand, have offices in Brazil and Mexico then, right?
Absolutely, yeah, they do. They do because they started coming to the country in the 60s, the 70s, and you have interesting stories behind both of them. Some of those are already mapped. Some of those I try to bring in my work as well. For instance, in the 60s, the United States invested in through the USAID program, in a program to develop legal knowledge in Brazil. And by that, they foster a specific local legal elite, and that would then be hired by these law firms that would come to the country. So they do have offices in Brazil and Mexico, and they became these points of contact between international capital and local jurisdictions.
And Marco, if I can ask, how Chinese investors then get into contact with them? Is it a common practice? Are the law firms actively approaching the investors? How does that work? How do they come into contact?
So this is an evolving picture, right, Monica? If I think about 20 years ago, what would happen is that these companies would contact either these law firms also have offices in China, right? In Hong Kong, usually, and they might have in Shanghai or other cities, but usually would be in Hong Kong. They would contact that local office, which would put them in contact with someone usually in a big in one of these center jurisdictions, like such as New York, London, and then you would then contact with the local jurisdiction. So you see there's a triangulation between jurisdictions, China, Anglo-American, and then Brazil. This is evolving because Chinese companies, also the Chinese lawyers in these offices, the Chinese law firms are becoming more confident, are becoming more knowledgeable about these jurisdictions. And sometimes you would see that the Anglo-American law firms taken out of the picture, right? You see a more direct connection, which is one of the points of interest that I'm interested in focusing and try to do with this research, is trying to understand when you take this Anglo-American actor from the picture, what happens, right? Do we see new legal forms being played? Do we see different ways of doing business directly between Brazilian, Mexican, and Chinese actors? So this is one of the questions that guide me. But the overall picture is that these Chinese companies entered the countries through the help of these Anglo-American lawyers and law firms who had the know-how. And as the time goes by, this picture changes. We see either direct business between local actors and Chinese actors. We see Chinese companies establish subsidiaries in the countries, and the biggest subsidiaries usually have local law teams. So they bring in-house knowledge to the country, which might so you don't need an Anglo-American law firm to be helping you out, right? You can do business with your in-house legal team, which will connect with the.
And Marco, just to make sure how it works, that we all understand. So, of course, first to enter the market, it's with the assistance, oftentimes, of this big Anglo-American law firms. But once on the ground, once the Chinese investors develop the practice, such as they have subsidiaries, they have in-house team of counsels, of lawyers. But that would be local lawyers, meaning Brazilian in Brazil and Mexican in Mexico.
Yes, usually that's the case, but also you see what some people call the shadow administration, the Chinese shadow, that you have local teams with local lawyers. You have a Chinese manager or Chinese directors that will follow the local teams. And that's a very interesting mechanism of exchanging knowledge and building this know-how about the local jurisdiction. These teams, the Chinese manager usually will send back reports to the legal team back in China, which will be this center of information about different jurisdictions. Then you have also nuances between companies, right? Some companies will provide more freedom and protagonist to this local subsidiary. So I talked to different types of companies, some SOEs, some private companies, big, small companies, some large SOEs with large legal teams. They will allow for these local legal teams to take action without always consulting the team back in China. You have other companies that are more centralized. So every legal decision needs to go back to China and have the okay from China, which produces some noise along the way, which sometimes I would hear Brazilian local lawyers and workers complaining about how much time they would make to make a simple decision. So you have another, I think one key takeaway is this is an evolving picture. Another one is that we're seeing more direct exchanges between local lawyers, local law firms, and Chinese legal actors. And a third takeaway is that this is a variable picture. You have a big, let's say, framework and some patterns that you can find this process, but also if you look, different companies are doing different things.
Great. Certainly, it's a evolving picture, because even if we connect to one of the points you raised, Chinese law firms, meanwhile, they develop as well. Chinese law firms, in terms of their international practice 20 years ago, is nothing compared to what we have today. And I remember myself when I was working for one of the Chinese law firms back in the days in Beijing, The law firm was quite expansive in terms of opening new law offices across the world, Latin America included, and specifically in my case, that was Mexico and Brazil exactly. So there is also the attempt to develop the expertise back in China concerning the specific jurisdictions. Oftentimes, it's not only about law as such, at least that was my experience, but also about business development opportunities. But definitely, as I was out of the law firm since already a couple of years, things have surely changed. But how do you see the Chinese law firms operating now in Brazil and Mexico? Are they present? Are they going solo in terms of providing their legal services? Do they work more with local counsels? Do they absorb local lawyers to their structures? How does that look like when we think about Chinese law firms being there?
Mhm. So great. I think, and you have a great experience there, Monica, right? In terms of being able to have been working with these Chinese law firms. This is something that also is interesting to map how these law firms became interested in bringing the foreign experience, foreign knowledge to these law firms. We see this case with Mexican lawyers that were hired to go to China, Brazilian lawyers that were hired to go to China. Then they will be sent back in some way to establish offices, local offices, to bridge these connections with both countries. I'd say this is certainly an important movement that we see. Chinese law firms are becoming more active. Perhaps 10 years ago, 15 years ago, nobody knew who were the Chinese law firms. Nobody had contacts with them. Sometimes you would work with them, but through working groups that were coordinated and led by Anglo-American law firms, Anglo-American lawyers, that triangulation I was talking about. Now we see an incipient movement that these Chinese law firms are becoming they are the ones that are leading these working groups. So you might have a Chinese company trying to invest in Brazil. They will hire the Chinese law firm that will establish this working group. They will contact their points of reference in the country or in China that have knowledge about, let's say, Brazil, and they will reference a Brazilian law firm that is going to become part of the working group for this investment. So they are becoming more relevant. Nevertheless, I'd say they are still not a very significant player. They are still trying to develop this network. I would say when I started doing this research, there was this feeling that something would be groundbreaking in terms of these Chinese law firms dominating the market or becoming extremely relevant. But what we see is a very cautious approach, especially I'd say for the companies, because even though you are making more work between local actors and Chinese actors, the type of legal forms, and going back to that concept in terms of the social institution and legal that aspects of a deal, are still very much based on the blueprints that have been put in practice throughout the last decades. So a Chinese company comes to invest in Brazil, it does so by the legal terms that are the usual legal terms, the usual legal language. So it will do arbitration, let's say, and then it will use a seat in New York with New York law, or in London or in Paris. So the seats are the same. Although, and there are, as I would say, again, this is an evolving picture. So we see, for instance, the investment in Chinese chambers of arbitration, right? CIETAC, we had the one from Beijing, and how this there is a bit of a push towards that, but a lot of resistance for local actors in doing so. And then because the Brazilian actor does not know what's CIETAC, and the CIETAC is one of the biggest Chinese chambers for arbitration, right?
So just for the audience to decode, in general, arbitration is a mechanism to resolve disputes as an alternative to litigation. And it offers a whole number of characteristics that distinguish arbitration from litigation, with a whole number of them, and we will not be focusing on them today, but that's definitely a method that is commonly used in the context of international disputes and international contracts, because it does not mean going to courts of the specific parties. So if we have a contract between Chinese company and Brazilian company, then we don't need to go to Chinese or Brazilian courts, which is what obviously the parties are typically hesitant to do because of the concern of local protectionism. And therefore they can resort to something what is supposed to be more neutral, and that is arbitration, meaning private way of resolving disputes, but it's also obviously final and binding. And CIETAC indeed is one of the leading institutions. And I've also observed that in terms of bargaining power, Chinese parties do bring it often to the table, that yes, for years we've been using various international arbitration institutions, various international service providers, but we also have experienced institutions back in China, so why not using them? So this will be an ongoing question of legal infrastructure more broadly. What are the shifts in terms of the legal mechanisms that will be used? And definitely, just in the context of dispute resolution, we can observe the collaborations between Chinese and Latin American institutions, Brazilian institutions, Peruvian institutions. This is a very interesting trend to follow, and it will be interesting to see whether there will be a wider use of more local institutions, whether from Latin America or in China in the future, Sino-Latin American contracts. But Marco, if I could just ask you one more question. So we've been talking about this Anglo-American law firms. We've been talking about how Chinese law firms evolve in the context. But could you tell us a little bit more about Latin American law firms and lawyers in this flow of Chinese capital and investment? What is their role? What is their position? How has this evolved? Because I'm sure it has evolved as well.
Totally, yes. So what I see is that with this Chinese, the Chinese factors and new factors in the interactions that are, let's say, in this dynamics of the legal profession of each country, right? Both Brazil and Mexico are large economies, somewhat internationalized for Latin American parameters. And I think you mentioned a very interesting point when you're saying that the thing about the bargaining power is sometimes we're as, let's say, researchers or we try to find patterns so our claims are become more relevant, right? I think about science in general, to hope to find a pattern that's general. But an interesting element of the China issue, or what's happening with China, is that it's very much nuanced, right? I think the Chinese approach to international law, to international deals, cross-border interactions, they have a sensibility towards local differences. So what we see perhaps in Brazil is not the same that's happening in Gambia. What's happening in Mexico is not the same in Argentina. We might have similar actors, we might find similarities, but then the approach changes. One of these aspects is the thing about bargaining power, right? So Brazil and Mexico, and by that I mean the business community, the government, and also the lawyers and law firms, they have been working in cross-border deals for a long time. So they have established they have a very much established legal profession with international contacts, with networks in Anglo-American legal professions. It was often usual for Brazilian Mexican lawyers to go abroad to study. So they would go to the United States, do a master's, an LLM, or some country in Europe. They would establish a professional network. They would become capable of these global legal forms, to do arbitration, to have a very good command of English, which would also allow them to engage with these international companies. So we're talking about two legal professionals that were international, that were capable of legal forms. And when this, let's say, the China actors, the Chinese capital arrives in the country, it it let's say it finds success in Brazil and Mexico also because of the readily available local knowledge that was there. I would say especially in Brazil, because Brazil was after the 90s, we had this the process of liberalization of the economy. We had a lot of international capital flows that arrived in Brazil, and that led to a process of the business community and the local lawyers and law firms to understand how to receive this international capital, right? How to absorb this international capital. And that is in terms of business practices, right? How to meet with these international investors, but also how to translate this capital, this international capital, into legal forms. So the capital arrives from the United States in a different structure, let's say through a specific corporate structure, and then to be able to invest in Brazil in a, let's say, a regulated sector, such as a utility sector, the electrical sector, you have specific strategies that allow for this capital to be more profitable, to be more successful. And who does know that are the local law firms. So they had this knowledge, right? They knew how to do it. When the Chinese arrived, they take benefit of this knowledge that was already in place and knew how to welcome international investors. What happens then is that you find noises in this interaction, right? The Chinese, I think they are also experiencing themselves in terms of trying to understand how to invest abroad. How do you make investments in terms of business practices? So I hear a lot from the lawyers that I interviewed is that, well, we do a meeting with a Chinese counterpart, and there are several issues from not being able to communicate, not having English as a common language, to the fact that sometimes they would agree to do something and then that agreement would not have, let's say they would sign an agreement and the Chinese counterpart would not follow through that because, well, you see in the business practice, it's different, right? You don't have that weight that we give, at least in some Western societies, to sign agreement, and several other issues that arose throughout this process. So interesting, these local law firms, they nevertheless saw a huge opportunity in the Chinese capital, right? Economically and also in terms of prestige. So they began investing in trying to build knowledge about Chinese Chinese companies, Chinese law firms, and the Chinese country. So we see that through different aspects. For instance, the creation of China desks. Many law firms in Brazil and also in Mexico created China desks, which is not an innovation of the country, something that also was being done in the United States for a while and some jurisdictions in Europe. But this became a practice and also a way of showing, oh, well, we do have knowledge. We do have knowledge. We are interested in Chinese investors. Another example is that Brazilian law firms began investing in professionals that had some Chinese background, either if they spoke Mandarin or if they studied in China. So they would bring this not exactly this legal knowledge, but this cultural knowledge, being able to understand how to deal with these companies. We saw that in terms of hiring consultants, so people that are not a law firm hiring a professor or hiring someone that had experience in China but was not a lawyer in itself, right? So this process has led to a sophistication in some way of these local law firms to try to be able to welcome more of the Chinese capital. And the process, which is still incipient and connects to, I think, one of the important questions, or the questions that I leave open, is how much that will influence the future exchange of global capital flows, in the sense that we now see established channel between both countries. in terms of lawyers and law firms, which was not the case 10 years ago. Now we see this established channel because Chinese law firms are investing in themselves in those examples that I gave, and also the local law firms are investing in building the bridges with Chinese counterparts. Now that you have the bridge, does that mean that we're going to see innovations happening or not? It is
And
still not
Marco,
clear.
And Marco, just further on that bridge, do you know if there are also local Mexican or Brazilian law firms that actually start or already have the established offices in China? Does it work in this direction as well?
So that's a funny thing, Monica, because we saw that movement. There has been cases of law firms, Brazilian and Mexican law firms, opening offices in China, but for several and different reasons that didn't work out very well. In Brazil, I can't remember exactly the number, but I think it was a handful of law firms that opened office in China, and almost all of them closed. Same with Mexico. So we don't see that, that way around is not. Although now I recently read there was again another Brazilian law firm that opened up an office in China. So they're still trying to do that in terms of, I'd say, especially in terms of business development, as you mentioned, right? This idea of being able to make business, to attract clients there in China. But then if you go into that issue, I would say there is also the issue about the Chinese legal market in itself, which is challenge, right? Trying to understand how to navigate the corporate culture in China is not as easy for a foreigner office.
Sure, and that's also the reason why many of these Anglo-American law firms that you mentioned in the first place, especially post-COVID, they closed the offices, well-established offices in China. So that definitely is, as you say, like we go back and forth with the fact that this is an evolving picture, but that definitely is an evolving picture. And Mark, I really appreciate the comment of yours when you said that actually acting as this kind of middleman, it's not only about law, it's not only purely about law, because there's a whole number of related issues such as language capacities. And you mentioned the fact that oftentimes it's not even question of Spanish or Portuguese abilities. It's oftentimes the question of English abilities to communicate effectively. In order to communicate, we need to have a tool. And adding to that, the fact of decision making, you mentioned also in your previous remark that oftentimes it's a lengthy process reporting back to China in order to get permissions and approvals for certain actions. This oftentimes is also pointed as a problem that, at least in my research, I've observed tendencies that the countries receiving an investment from China, they oftentimes report this kind of cultural communication problems, that it's not really clear who makes decisions and therefore who should be approached for the proper decision. If you pair it up with the language capabilities, that might be limited because, as you say, oftentimes the senior decision makers, they don't speak any of the languages, then obviously it is an issue to work on. But to be constructive, so let's think about future generations of lawyers. And I know that also the current generations invest in developments in these areas, but do you observe exchanges at the law school level among the law schools? Is there a drive to learn about each other? Your own experience as a scholar at the Yenching Academy is a great example of that, but is it more common when it comes to more specific exchanges between China and Mexico or China and Brazil? And how do we see that? Where are we?
Totally. I totally agree with you in that sense. I think this is something that is also understood by Chinese actors, right? Chinese stakeholders. They know that these have been challenges in the last decades, and the Chinese transformation was so fast that I think that they didn't have enough time in that sense for to be able to develop all the human skills, let's say, the necessary trade skills, corporate skills that you would need to be able to successfully engage with international counterparts. So probably what we would see is that new generations, they come to the table with, let's say, better language skills, being able to have studied abroad for a year, so they have more connections, understanding of what's happening, what's the cultural differences between China, which is not the case, let's say, for the established actors, for the established lawyers right now. And I saw that very closely with my experience in China in terms of seeing how the universities, of course, we're talking about perhaps some of the more funded and institutionally established universities in China, Beida, right, Peking University, Tsinghua, but still, I think this is a process. Talking to friends that were studying or working in other cities, how these institutions are investing in trying to both promote your own students in these capacities, right? So you have courses being given in English, you have foreign professors that are being invited to come to give an intensive course, to give courses, as well as trying to, I'm gonna pretty much, I would say, and trying to develop these skills within their own community. So you have this process of internationalization in these institutions. They're building partnerships. They're sending their students abroad. They're receiving students, and we see that with both Brazil and Mexico. I'd say Brazil more than Mexico, and there are reasons for that we can discuss later. But especially with Brazil, we have a rising number of partnerships being established between Chinese universities and Brazilian universities, and that allows for the exchange of students. However, this is still a very small number, and I think the COVID impacted massively what was happening. There was a rising trend in terms of exchanges, and that data was cut. Still, we see that effort, we see that interest. I'd say my feeling is that the new generations are going to there's going to be a shift that is going to be fast as well in terms of when this generation rises up to this decision making roles. Still, it is still how, if I can, I'm going to give you an anecdote example, right? But when I was studying Yangqing, my Chinese colleagues, they had a good command of English, right? We were able to communicate. Many of them had studied abroad. Many of them were doing internships abroad, even had the goal of working abroad, right? Making careers abroad. So that was more part of their mindset and then their experience. But the professors, the school staff still had some challenges in communicating, right? And that's gonna change, but it's not going to be as fast as, let's say, 5 years from now. So this is a generation of shift that we'll probably see happening next years.
Yeah, and definitely the work can be done in both directions in terms of fostering this mutual understanding. And again, understanding does not mean to accepting the solutions of one or another legal system, but acquiring the knowledge to be able to effectively engage with that legal system in both directions. And I am familiar with your work on the topic that we discussed today, that there are also other challenges to foster this kind of legal dialogue between the regions, between the specific jurisdictions, such as dialogues specifically between the law firms, such as dialogues on the state-to-state level in terms of promoting the exchanges in both directions. So, Marco, if I could ask you, if you see this dialogues between the law firms, for instance, what are the typical areas of law where the lawyers from both sides, China and on the other side, Brazil or Mexico, they see themselves engaging in? What are these areas that they want to understand better on both sides?
Mm-hmm. So I'd say there are points of synergy and points of common interest. In terms of common interest, what often comes to mind it is this idea of digitalization, right? So being able, understanding how to do that, and I think China has a very strong comparative advantage on that. It has been pursuing this path of digitalization for a while now. It is quite a successful example, with some challenges, with some critiques, but it has done it more than other countries. So lawyers and law firms that are established in this culture can offer some insights into that direction. Then you have the idea of synergy that Chinese law firms will try to understand. At the end of the day, they're trying to do business, right? They're trying to do deals. And how do you do that? You need to, I would say, learn what you don't know. And Chinese law firms will usually have, and Chinese actors in general, have a hard time to understand the very complex jurisdictions that we have in Latin America, right? With so many overlapping regulations, with environmental, labor, so many public law issues that make these jurisdictions hard to invest. So in these exchanges, we will see a lot of these Chinese actors trying to understand how to do business. What are the nuances, the restrictions, the pitfalls, the opportunities of these jurisdictions. On the other hand, what I'll see from the Brazilian lawyers is this interest in trying to understand the cultural dimension of doing business with Chinese actors, because these firms are very much interested in, again, in the capital and the prestige of doing business with Chinese companies. And if I say in Brazil, for instance, Chinese companies are now becoming very, very relevant. And doing a parenthesis, but we have this international context now with the U.S. retraction from the war in some way, with the tariffs, right? There is this even a cultural perception that the U.S. is not a reliable partner anymore. So, and on the other hand, China is positioning it itself, at least in Latin America, as a reliable partner, as someone that it's not going to interfere in your politics, but it's going to give you capital. So there is this I'd say Brazilian law firms are interested in facilitating that in some way, attracting this capital. So these would be the topics that I would say would be general happening in terms of making deals, right? But I think there is an open venue, which it's hard to map in terms of exactly what might be happening, but in you get to know each other, right? These law firms, the stakeholders get to know, they build confidence among themselves, and there might be venues to do, which I think the BRICS, the Brazil, Russia, China, India, South Africa, plus with the new countries incorporate, that is trying to build new mechanisms of governance, right? How do you govern these cross-border deals in different ways than not those necessarily used by, let's say, the Anglo-American counterparts? So you can use arbitration for sure, but you can do arbitration in other places with other rules. You can even not do arbitration, to do mediation, right? Which is something that's so close to the heart of Chinese culture. You can perhaps not use the US dollar to do business, but if you don't use the US dollar, you have to use perhaps another financial institution to do this transaction, right? You're not going to use the SWIFT model. So there are different governance mechanisms. By governance, I mean that, right? How do you govern? How do you make it stable and order that when you have confidence and established channels might be easier to do?
Thank you. Thank you, Marco, for that. I think this observation of global shifts will be translated then effectively to how the legal services and law firms will participate in terms of facilitating and addressing Chinese investment in Latin America. And I talk obviously about opportunities, but also about the risks, because that definitely is something that we get to hear about. And as you say, this is an evolving picture. I couldn't agree more, and it would be very interesting to see indeed how this will evolve in the years to come. And I hope that actually also more of the local content, local lawyers can effectively advance in understanding also how China functions, with what kind of opportunities and risks it brings for the benefit of all. So we have touched upon the whole number of interesting issues, and I'm very, very thankful for that. I myself have learned a lot, and I will definitely follow your work and how this landscape is changing. And now what would be left for us to do is to hear your recommendation or recommendations, because this podcast has a tradition of our speakers recommending us something interesting to look, to listen to read. So what's your recommendation?
That's great, Monica. Yes. So if I may, I'm going to do two recommendations. I want to do one more related to what we were discussing, and another one more in terms of leisure. I think in terms academically, and this is a work that this is a book that I contributed to, but I'm not trying to do marketing for myself. It's actually a very good book. It's a case book that was edited by Matthew Reary from the University of Oxford that brings together several case studies from Chinese cross-border deals happening in different jurisdictions in the global south. It's a very interesting work. It was a work that was conducted for, I think we have been discussing and meeting for 2 or 3 years to try to develop the insights. It brings a lot of primary material, interviews, and tries to make this analysis. I think that connects what you were saying, to build this knowledge that we try to look at this phenomenon not as, which sometimes is hard, but try to make analytical analysis that are not, as much as possible, not as biased or unnecessarily critical, right? I think there are challenges with Chinese cross-border deals. There are opportunities, risks, but there is something also interesting, something that perhaps we can learn about what's happening, right? And I think this case study brings this both facets to it. It shows how some cross-border deals highlight how Chinese companies show a very skillful way of investing abroad, that if we want to look into law schools, from business schools, from political schools of politics, we can learn from their approach as well, which is not something that we see as much as in Western schools. But also
I will just add a good news is that this book is accessible in open access. I had the pleasure to read a couple of cases already. It's definitely a tool for everybody who wants to learn about Chinese investment. And again, it's in open access. Everybody can access that. We will add the link in the podcast episode description.
Yes, absolutely. That's a very good point. Yeah, which makes accessible, and yeah, I would invite everyone to take a look at that. And in terms of leisure, I have been reading a quite interesting book. It has been published, I think, a few years ago, but it's The Vegetarian from Han Kang, a South Korean author, which talks about this woman who takes a decision of not eating meat anymore, and through a nightmare that she has, and then that leads to different consequences in their personal and family life. I grabbed it in the airport and I was hooked up by it. And it's been interesting to think about life choices and how do we navigate or all these issues that the world is facing right now.
Thank you so much. I happen to read that one as well.
Nice.
So we definitely have more in common. Marco,
Nice.
again, thank you for recommendation, but even more, thank you for all of the interesting content that you shared with us. I wish you best of luck with your future work. And we work with Marco continuously on advancing understanding of Chinese investment and ramifications of it. So you will be hearing more about our work. We'll be happy to share. Thank you, everybody. Thank you very much.
Thanks. Thanks so much, Monica. Thanks so much for the invitation, and congratulations for this work. This is important and meaningful to build more knowledge and build more exchanges. Thanks for having me, and looking forward to keep this conversation going.